Many years ago, when I was a priest, I was involved in a movement in the Catholic Church called Marriage Encounter. There was later a Protestant version of it also, and the focus of it was to support and strengthen marriages. At the heart of it, and I think when I made my weekend, that it struck me that one of the key parts of the experience was the use of, a song that I treasured a lot and had been very transforming for me in my own life. And it was a song that came from the play Man of La Mancha. Anybody remember that play? One of the most powerful songs in that play is The Impossible Dream. And so on Sunday morning, when we were to write, in a sense, at that time was called a love letter to our spouse, and as a clergy person, as a priest, it was to the church, to the whole church. And they played that song right before you began to write that letter. And what moved me was about the dream, how impossible sometimes things seem to be, but it is this dream that overrides the difficulties of life, the struggles of life, that it is holding on to something beyond yourself, above yourself, that can enable you to make it through the struggles and the trials, the pain, and the suffering of life. And I really bought into it. I bought into the dream, and I bought into the challenge that presented me as a clergy person. Several years later, I met a woman from a couple that I had actually given their weekend. And it was always done with three married couples, and a clergy person. And I met the wife of this one couple, and we were chatting, and she was just really struggling in her life. And so I said to her, I said, well, just remember that dream. Remember the dream that we had on the weekend. And she said, to hell with that. She said, when I needed new tires on my car, and when my kids were sick, and my marriage was still struggling even after the weekend. How can you think about the dream? How can you think about the future when all the struggles of the present moment seem more powerful? To heck with that. It's impossible. And I was really discouraged at that point. Discouraged, one, that she had lost that sense of vision, if you will. And discouraged because it called into question for myself even the possibility that things can be different, that transformation and change can really happen. And threw me for a loop, like I'm sure it does for many of us, right? You can believe in something so strongly and so powerfully, and then when you encounter somebody who's had that struggle, it leads you to also question your own sense of direction and purpose and vision. I'm sure that in the writing of the gospel, Luke is dealing with the same kind of thing for his community. There was great hopes and dreams that the message of Jesus would indeed change and transform the world. That they had really come to believe that his generosity, his compassion, his willingness to forgive even those who had crucified him, that all of that it was like this was going to happen. And the immediate generation after Jesus really did believe it was all going to happen, that the world was going to change and transform, and people would love everybody would love everybody, and there would be no more poverty, and none of the struggles, the things that people had to struggle with. They really believed that. But then the next generation comes along, and it didn't happen. At least in the way that they had expected it. It didn't happen the way that they wanted it to happen. And so it threw them into a tizzy, if you will. It disrupted their lives. It disrupted their community. That things didn't turn out the way that they had expected it, and now they weren't sure anymore. In fact, they had begun to disbelieve the things that Jesus had said. They had begun to question their own integrity and their own commitment to the faith. And so the opening verses of the gospel tells us that the writer is interested in if you will, restoring confidence in the message of Jesus for his community. He writes at the beginning, I'm doing this, most excellent one, so that you may know that the faith that you have received is indeed the genuine thing. It's the real thing. It's the true thing. In other words, that there isn't truth outside of that. That this is the true vision. That the vision that the reign of God is at hand, and that centering one's life around Jesus can bring about that reign of God. So he writes the whole gospel with that sense to strengthen the faith of his community that has begun to question that maybe there are things that are impossible. Maybe there just are things that, even though we can dream about them, that it's pointless to dream because they'll never come true. And so in the context of the gospel, even today, you have a sense of this struggle. Two people come to the temple to pray. And you have to understand, right, that in the writing of this gospel, albeit a couple of generations after Jesus, that it still must be so strong in their sensitivity to what has happened in their own life and what potentially could happen for the world, that the division or the contrast between the Pharisee and the tax collector is still very raw for them. In Jesus' audience, this would have been a powerful statement because people in Jesus' community really did look up to the Pharisees. And in this instance, the Pharisees represent a whole world view of how things should be. And notice what that worldview is based upon. Even though it's not really said, you can kind of get a sense of the taste in your mouth that worldview of the Pharisees is based upon arrogance. I'm better than everyone else. And if that worldview of the Pharisee is based upon such an understanding of arrogance, I'm better than everyone else, that you can imagine what all the other connections in that worldview are related to. Will I see that there is dignity and value and worth in the blind person, in the leper, in the person laying in the gutter? Will there be value and worth in someone other than myself? And if your whole worldview is based upon arrogance, no, you're not going to see value and worth in anybody but people like yourself. And so in Jesus' community, even though they looked up to the Pharisee, perhaps they were buying into that vision of the Pharisee, that they were good for nothing. And if you've been told that enough, right, you begin to believe it. And if you begin to believe that vision, then you begin to live your life pretty much that way. And contrast is the tax collector. And notice, he already knows his place in the sense. And you have to remember that if you were a Jewish person in the job of being a tax collector, to everybody else in the Jewish community, you were as good as collaborating with the Romans. You were a Roman collaborator. You didn't abandon who you were as a Jew, but to everybody in your community, you were a collaborator. And that meant participating in all, even if you never took up arms against your own community, you collaborated in every policy, economic, social, political policy of the Roman Empire. And so you understood that wasn't, you needed a job, and you needed to put food on your family's table, and this was the job, and you were just doing your job. It didn't mean that you thought you were a collaborator, but the whole community did. And notice, he can't even bring himself to stand in the center place, but rather has to attach himself to the wall in a sense. And he has convinced himself that he's good for nothing. And the challenge, a part of what Luke is suggesting, whether it's in Jesus' day or Luke's own community, is you see, you can buy into that vision of the world that the Pharisee wants us to buy into. And we can think we are good for nothing. And that our dreams or visions don't really matter, because all that matters is what the authorities and what the leaders tell us. And pretty soon, you begin to think that there isn't any chance at all, as this friend of mine I told in the story, that nothing's going to really change. And sometimes you hear it. Oh, the poor are always going to have with you, so why bother? Oh, those people at the edges and the margins, what can you do? I've got limited means myself. And you see, we buy into a vision that is built at its heart on arrogance and superiority, forcing the rest of us into a passivity that means that we can't even begin to dream the world can be any other way than what it is. That's perhaps why in the prophet Joel, you see what it says. Joel's written in the time when it was still collapsing, the kingdoms of Judah and Israel, and people were going mass deportations out to Babylon, and people were fleeing down to Egypt. I mean, it was a terrible moment in the life of ancient Israel and Judah. And it did seem like the world was coming to an end, or was close at hand. And all they could see for their future, if you read the last part of that text, all they could see for their future was death and destruction and fire and brimstone. And that's all they could see. And they probably did dream about that their dreams were filled with terrible things in their future. And yet, in the midst of that, you see, that what God, through the prophet Joel, invites, and what the gospel and Jesus is inviting, is that rich world vision carries truth for us. Carries truth for us, meaning that it is not just something we dream up, but something that concretely can happen, where we take the dreams and the visions and turn them into action. And God says through the prophet Joel, you know, you may think that there's no life after 50. You all proved them wrong, didn't you? And I'm sure some of your children and grandchildren, they think, what do you do down there in Sunlight? You proved them wrong. And God's saying to the prophet Joel, to the people of Israel and Judah, I'm going to prove the rest of the world wrong. Because you're going to have dreams, old people, that are not just dreams in your sleep, but dreams that are truly going to fashion a world that is different from what your children are now going to have to live in exile. And we're not going to leave the young people out of this. And it's sad that we don't have a lot of young people that could remind us of that, right, in this congregation. That we don't have people that can say, yeah, we can do this. Most of the time we say, we're exhausted, let somebody else do this. So here's the challenge. We can buy into the world vision described in the arrogance of the Pharisee that wants us all to think, just be passive. Your dream is never going to happen. Or we can buy into the vision not only that God has given to Joel, that there's going to be an abundance, but that we can buy even more into the vision of Jesus that asks each of us to create that world that we've dreamed about. Because that's the point, isn't it? Nobody else is going to feed the hungry except us. No one else is going to forgive the hate and anger and the violence except us. No one else is going to heal and make whole the earth on which we walk except us. The Pharisees say, forget it. It can't be done. Jesus says, dream it. It can be done because you're willing to make it happen.